Welcome, folks, to video number 2 in this video series on federalism. I am Miss Jennifer Blank, and I will be your guide on this journey. So today we are going to talk about different types of federalism. In the first video, let me go to that slide. So the first video, part 1, was key vocab. We defined federalism, and then we looked at different systems of government so that we could understand how federalism is different. Today we're looking at the different types of federalism. And then in part 3, which is a much longer video, we're going to talk about how government power works in federalism. So we're going to look at the interaction of the 3 branches and also the interaction of the state and federal governments in IRL, so to speak, in real life. So here we go. All right, so let's just review because I want to make sure we're on the same page, right? Federalism, 2 or more governments exercise power and authority over the same people in the same territory. You'll notice this is a slightly different definition because I want you to get used to focusing on the concepts. You're going to see on the AP exams, different concepts that you'll be shown different definitions for those concepts. And we need to make sure that you're able to recognize the key concept that the exam is asking you about, even if the words are a little bit different than the definition you memorized for class, right? So that definition, or the relationship between the federal government and the state governments, right? So we're looking at that division of power, okay? So the types of powers that we have delegated powers, otherwise known as enumerated. And remember, to enumerate means to list. Those are powers given to the federal government specifically by the Constitution. Reserved powers are state power alone. Concurrent powers are powers that are shared, and prohibited powers are denied from both. Okay, so you need to memorize these terms because you will see all 4 of these show up quite a bit on the AP exam. Now, prohibited powers sometimes are referred to as, so the federal government cannot regulate intra-state commerce. It can't do anything about commerce within the state. That's a prohibited power from the federal government. But a prohibited power from the state government is it can't coin money, right? So you also see prohibited powers in that context, but in most cases it's just powers that neither set has at all. All right, so dual federalism is actually the type of federalism we started out with. So dual federalism really focuses on dividing the state and national into separate spheres. Like they are completely separate. There's almost no overlap. The federal government's over here doing its own thing. The state government's over here doing their own thing, and never the twain shall meet. The whole idea is to prevent that concentration of power, and they want to stop any kind of collaboration or cooperation, because once that happens, then power is going to get concentrated, and they didn't want that. So it's important that we started out under dual federalism. That is not what we have anymore. We do not have dual federalism anymore, and I'm going to explain what we have in just a second. But dual federalism is separate spheres. They don't meet. They don't work together. They don't come together. Federal government does its thing. State government does its thing. They're not engaging, and that's on purpose. But we didn't stay that way. So once we hit the New Deal, we get this thing called cooperative federalism. Now, the New Deal took place in the 1930s. For those of you who are not aware of certain aspects of U.S. history, during the 1930s, the world, but particularly the United States, was engaging in the Great Depression, okay? It was the worst economic crisis in our history. You had 25% unemployment. There were breadlines. It was awful, awful, awful. And at this point, we were trying to take, our elected officials were trying to take drastic measures to try to solve this very, very deep problem. So we came up with this idea of cooperative federalism. Okay, because cooperative federalism emphasized an expanded role for the national government, and now we want cooperation between the national government and the states. And this took many different forms over the years, but bottom line, we're no longer separate. Now we're coming together. Not for everything, but for certain things in an effort to help deal with the Great Depression. But as we'll see, we didn't stay there. The expansion of the federal government's role continued unabated all the way up until right now. So we shifted in the 1930s from dual federalism to cooperative federalism. Now, just to give you some additional details on cooperative federalism, FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, he was president at the time, and that's the guy that we're talking about. He was the one who came up with the New Deal. Programs were typically funded by the federal government, but then the states took the job of making them happen. They were administered by states and local governments. So we're creating a cooperative framework, they call it. Okay, it's another word for cooperative federalism, which you might see on the AP exam, is picket fence federalism. You could see either one, cooperative or picket fence. They both mean the same thing, okay? And they are referring to state and national government coming together and cooperating, okay? Federal government pays for it. State governments carry out the policy. So there are two metaphors for these federalism. So dual federalism is a layer cake. They are separate layers. They do not intermingle. There's the federal, then there's the state. Separate layers. Cooperative, there's all this intermixing, right? So you have all these marbles, right? So the federal's here, but the federal's also here, and the states are here and here and here and here. See, so that's just sort of a visual representation of looking at a layer cake for dual and a marble cake for cooperative, just to give you a visual of what that might look like to help you understand the concept a little more. So federalism does become a Republican issue. Then in the late 60s, early 70s, we have this thing called new federalism, okay? So this is also called policy federalism, all right? And this began with President Richard Nixon. The Republican Party championed this idea of devolution, or the transfer of power from the national government to the states, okay? So instead of cooperating on everything, there are certain policies that were just returned to the states. But the federal government did retain power in other areas they didn't originally have. Okay, and when we say a Republican issue, in this context, we're actually talking about the Republican Party. Okay, so we'll get into more details when we talk about in the next video when we talk about some specifics. But at this point, we still have the federal and the state governments cooperating together. But in this time period, in the late 60s, early 70s, the federalism takes the shape of the national government returning certain things to the states, but keeping others. Okay? So, and then there's this little line down here. Under current conditions, liberals may have pragmatic reasons to support states' rights in some instances, such as in gay rights issues. Now, that's in certain contexts. But again, we're going to get into more details about this as we get more specific into policy. So, how do we implement cooperative federalism? How does that, because we talked about the federal government funding it, and then state governments carrying it out, enacting the policy, right? But what does that look like? How does that actually happen? So there are a couple of ways that this happens. So we have these things called categorical grants. We have strings attached federal grants. We have block grants and federal mandates. I'm going to explain what each of these are. So just to review, two federalisms, right? Old school, dual, right? Definition is there. This Supreme Court case, we're going to get into more detail in the next video. And then new school, cooperative federalism. State and federal governments work together to solve complex problems. Just a review of definitions, make sure we're all on the same page. So, fiscal means money. So, how do you get the states to do things that they don't do? Answer is money. What is the answer to almost any question ever asked? Money. Okay, that's a little bit, of an exaggeration, obviously, but basically, this fiscal federalism idea, this is where we get the grants. This is about the federal government giving states money to do things. That the state government won't do it unless they're getting the money to do it. Okay, so the way to coerce or force states into doing things will be to give them money to do it. So these things are called grants and aid, and there are two types. There's categorical grants and block grants. Categorical grants are targeted for specific purposes. There are strings attached. So, for example, a categorical education grant would be, your district has $1 million to spend on textbooks. You can only buy textbooks with that money. That's it. You also maybe have to purchase textbooks from certain companies, right? You have to purchase certain levels of textbooks, right? There will be requirements that you have to fulfill, a lot of requirements in order to get this money. And you can only spend it on textbooks, right? A block grant given for education would say, like, okay, here's $1 million. You can spend it on whatever you need to spend it on as long as it's for education. As long as you can provide a reason, a justification that it's going to help education in some way, you can spend it however you want. So the categorical grant is designed to force states to do exactly what the feds want. A block grant is really more designed to help states, and states can determine what it is that they need, right? Like the federal government wants to help with education, but each state is going to have different needs. Some states are going to need more textbooks, while others need computers, while others need to rebuild school buildings because they're falling apart, right? So different states and different localities are going to have different needs. So most states prefer block grants. The federal government loves the categorical grants. There are also mandates. So the federal government passes a law, then that means the state has to do it anyway, whether it's funded or not. So there are two types of mandates. There's funded, where the federal government gives you money to comply, or unfunded, where they just say, listen, we don't care how expensive it is, but you all better do it or we're coming for you. You know, you're violating federal law if you don't do it. So most of these mandates historically have applied to civil rights and the environment, but that's expanding now. We're going to explore that in class. Oftentimes, the state and local governments, like I said, have to pay the bill of the mandate that Congress set. And in some cases, these mandates are extremely expensive and really strain state and local budgets, make it very difficult for them to comply with the federal law. So here are examples of some mandates, right? So in 1986, the Asbestos Emergency Response Act and the Handicapped Children's Protection Act that required that folks update disabled accessibility for disabled folks, particularly disabled children, so that they had access to resources that abled children had access to. Also getting rid of asbestos since it was killing a whole lot of people. Then there's in 88, there was Drug-Free Workplace Acts, the Ocean Dumping Ban Act. 1990, we have a Clean Air Act. And so those are some examples of mandates, and here's some examples of how certain ones were implemented. So Columbus, Ohio spent 23% of the city budget trying to meet the environmental mandates, including testing for pesticides, right? So that 23% of the city budget went to other things before, but now they had to take that money out of the budget and just to comply with federal law. Doesn't mean that these things weren't good. These mandates are good, but it strains the city. So maybe they have to lay people off. Maybe they have to lay off city employees. Maybe they can't hire more teachers. Maybe they got to raise class sizes. Maybe they don't have as much garbage collection. Maybe they've got to lessen maintenance on the pipes in the city. I don't know. They got to cut the budget, right? Another example is public schools have to use internet filtering or schools lose E-rate subsidies. So that's an added cost that the federal government didn't pay for. Internet filtering services are extremely expensive and cut into a lot of the schools' budgets. So that changes what money they have available to provide for other education of kids. So some changes in spending, just to give you an idea. Obviously, 1997 is like way back, like I was in high school, so whoa, I'm really dating myself with that one, right? But just to give you a sense of how things changed. So 1929, before dual federalism took over, boom, boom, boom. Now, I can't wait to show you this number in class. This is almost a 50% increase in 50 years. Right? That's a big increase in spending, right? So we're going to examine what that means and how that has changed how the government works in class in more detail as we go through the course. But wow, just pause and stare at that data for a minute, like, whoo! Now, devolution is also a term that you need to memorize. Devolution is the return of power from the federal government to the state government that took place under cooperative federalism. So the idea is fueled or advanced by distrust of the federal government and the desire to save money by reducing the size of the bloated federal government. This is a favorite phrase of small government conservatives, typically Republicans, unless it involves national defense, in which case they want to spend a lot more money on it. So I do want to point out that each party has its own inherent contradictions. When we get to the unit in political parties, we're going to have some fun taking all of them to task over their inherent ideological contradictions. I love nothing more than to equally go after all the parties, as they all deserve it, and we need to keep them honest by keeping them in check. All right, so devolution example. Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act of 1996, otherwise called welfare reform. So it eliminated welfare and transferred money to the states as block grants. So welfare used to be a completely federal program and federally administered, and it shifted things. So now instead of being federally administered, they just give the state government money, and the state government has to make it happen. So states received wide latitude, a lot of ability to decide how to administer workfare, they called it for short, with the knowledge that Congress was counting on anti-poverty spending. There were strings attached, okay? So the head of the family had to work or they lost the benefit. Lifetime benefits were limited to 5 total years. An unmarried mother that was younger than 18 would only receive money if they stayed in school and lived with an adult. Immigrants were ineligible for the first 5 years. So that's an example of the strings that were attached and how devolution worked. That, folks, is the end of part 2. I hope you learned what you needed to, and I will see you in the next video.